What happens when a brilliant comedian walks into what should be a friendly late-night interview, only to find himself facing off against a host who seems determined to tear him down? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history, where Nathan Fielder found himself in a heated confrontation that would ultimately get him kicked off Jimmy Kimmel's show. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how power dynamics can turn ugly when egos clash. Before we get into this wild story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about hosts who abuse their platform. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. The evening started like any other taping at the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio. Nathan Fielder, known for his deadpan delivery and brilliant, satirical work on shows like Nathan for You and The Rehearsal, was scheduled to appear as a guest to promote his latest project. What should have been a straightforward promotional appearance quickly devolved into something much more sinister. From the moment Nathan walked onto that stage, something felt off. The usual warmth that guests typically receive was notably absent, replaced by an almost palpable tension that seemed to emanate from the host himself. Jimmy's opening questions weren't the typical softball inquiries that guests usually face on late-night television. Instead, they carried an edge, a sharpness that suggested this wasn't going to be the friendly chat that viewers and Nathan himself had probably expected. The first red flag came when Jimmy introduced Nathan not with the usual enthusiasm and genuine interest in his work, but with what can only be described as thinly veiled condescension. The way he described Nathan's comedy style wasn't celebratory, it was dismissive, painting him as someone whose humor was perhaps too niche or intellectual for mainstream audiences. Nathan, ever the professional, initially tried to roll with the punches. His responses were measured, thoughtful, and delivered with that characteristic dry wit that his fans have come to love. But as the interview progressed, it became increasingly clear that Jimmy wasn't interested in having a genuine conversation about Nathan's work or creative process. Instead, he seemed intent on putting Nathan in uncomfortable positions, asking pointed questions about the ethics of his comedy and whether he felt his approach to humor was exploitative of the people who appeared in his shows. The atmosphere in the studio began to shift noticeably. The audience, who had initially been receptive and ready to laugh, started to sense the growing tension. You could see it in their faces, the confusion about whether this was part of some elaborate bit, or if something genuinely uncomfortable was unfolding before their eyes. The studio band, usually a source of musical punctuation to lighten moments or transition between topics, seemed to retreat into the background, uncertain about when or if they should jump in to ease the mounting pressure. What made this situation particularly uncomfortable was Nathan's genuine attempts to engage with the questions in good faith. He wasn't dismissive or defensive. He was trying to have a real conversation about his work and the complexities of comedy in the modern landscape. But Jimmy wasn't interested in nuance or thoughtful discussion. He kept pushing, kept probing, kept trying to corner Nathan into admitting that his comedy was somehow problematic, or that he was taking advantage of regular people for laughs. The turning point came when Jimmy brought up a specific segment from Nathan for You, one that had been particularly controversial online. Instead of approaching it with curiosity or genuine interest in Nathan's perspective, Jimmy launched into what can only be described as an attack. He questioned Nathan's integrity, his motivations, and essentially accused him of being a fraud who hid behind the guise of helping small businesses while actually exploiting them for entertainment value. Nathan's demeanor began to change. The polite, measured responses gave way to something more direct, more pointed. He pushed back against Jimmy's characterizations, explaining the genuine care and consideration that went into each segment of his show. He talked about the relationships he built with the business owners, the real help he provided, and the collaborative nature of the comedy that emerged from those interactions. But Jimmy wasn't having it. He doubled down, suggesting that Nathan was being disingenuous and that his explanations were just elaborate justifications for questionable behavior. The studio audience was now clearly uncomfortable. The laughter had died down to nervous chuckles and awkward silence. Some audience members were looking around, unsure of how to react to what was unfolding. This wasn't the light entertainment they had come to see. This was something else entirely. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every uncomfortable moment, every strained exchange between host and guest. Nathan's patience was clearly wearing thin, but he maintained his composure even as Jimmy's attacks became more personal and direct. The host seemed emboldened by what he perhaps perceived as Nathan's reluctance to fight back aggressively, mistaking professionalism for weakness. Jimmy's next line of questioning crossed a line that even the most confrontational interviewers rarely approach. He began to question not just Nathan's work, but his character as a person, suggesting that someone who would put regular people in awkward situations for comedy must have some fundamental moral deficiency. The audience was now visibly uncomfortable, with many people shifting in their seats and exchanging worried glances. This wasn't the jovial late-night entertainment they had signed up for. Some were starting to pull out their phones, perhaps sensing that they were witnessing something that would become a significant moment in television history. The energy in the room had completely shifted from anticipation and entertainment to tension and unease. Nathan finally decided he had heard enough. His response was swift, articulate, and devastating in its precision. He calmly but firmly addressed each of Jimmy's accusations, systematically dismantling the host's arguments with the kind of logical clarity that had made his comedy so effective. He pointed out the hypocrisy in Jimmy's critique, noting that late-night television itself was built on the foundation of making entertainment out of other people's lives, whether through monologue jokes about politicians and celebrities or through the very format of having guests on to promote their work for the host's benefit. Nathan's counterattack was surgical in its effectiveness. He highlighted how Jimmy's show regularly featured segments that could be considered exploitative, from pranks on unsuspecting members of the public to comedy bits that relied on making fun of people's appearances or circumstances. The difference, Nathan pointed out, was that his work was transparent about its nature and involved willing participants who were fully aware of what they were getting into, while traditional late-night comedy often punched down at people who had no say in how they were portrayed. Jimmy's reaction to being called out so effectively was telling. Instead of acknowledging the validity of Nathan's points or attempting to engage in genuine discussion, he became defensive and increasingly hostile. The mask of professional television host began to slip, revealing something uglier underneath. He interrupted Nathan repeatedly, raised his voice, and began making personal attacks that had nothing to do with the supposed topic of discussion. The situation reached a boiling point when Jimmy made a comment that crossed every line of professional decorum. He suggested that Nathan's comedy was a reflection of his inability to connect with people in real life, implying that his entire career was built on his personal inadequacies and social failures. It was the kind of deeply personal attack that has no place in a professional interview setting, the kind of comment that revealed more about the person making it than the person it was directed at. Nathan's response was immediate and powerful. He stood up from his chair, looked directly at Jimmy, and delivered a response that was both controlled and devastating. He called out the host's unprofessional behavior, his apparent need to tear down guests to make himself feel superior, and his complete failure to conduct himself with even basic courtesy. Nathan's words were measured but cutting, delivered with the kind of precision that comes from someone who has spent years perfecting the art of communication. The studio fell completely silent. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure of how to handle a situation that had spiraled so far beyond the bounds of normal television. Jimmy's face was red, whether from anger or embarrassment was unclear, but his discomfort was obvious to everyone in the room. He had clearly not expected Nathan to fight back so effectively, and now found himself on the defensive in his own studio. What happened next would become the defining moment of the entire incident. Jimmy, perhaps realizing that he had lost control of the situation and was coming off poorly, made a decision that would cement his role as the clear antagonist in this confrontation. Instead of attempting to salvage the situation with an apology or by trying to steer the conversation back to safer territory, he chose to escalate further. Jimmy began making increasingly wild accusations, bringing up unrelated controversies, and attempting to paint Nathan as someone who was fundamentally dishonest about his intentions and his work. He questioned Nathan's success, suggested that his critical acclaim was undeserved, and even made veiled threats about Nathan's future in the entertainment industry. It was a shocking display of abuse of power, using his platform and position to attempt to intimidate and humiliate a guest who had done nothing more than defend himself against unfair attacks. Nathan remained calm throughout this barrage, which seemed to infuriate Jimmy even more. The contrast between the two men was stark. Nathan composed and articulate in his responses, Jimmy increasingly unhinged and desperate in his attacks. The audience was now clearly on Nathan's side, with some people actually booing Jimmy's behavior, something virtually unheard of at a late-night talk show taping. The final straw came when Jimmy made a comment that was so far beyond the pale that even his own production team began to look uncomfortable. He questioned Nathan's mental health, suggesting that anyone who would create the kind of comedy Nathan was known for must be suffering from some kind of psychological disorder. It was not only professionally inappropriate, but potentially libelous, the kind of statement that could have serious legal ramifications and certainly had no place in what was supposed to be a promotional interview. Nathan's response was swift and final. He had clearly reached his limit with Jimmy's behavior and was no longer willing to sit there and be subjected to personal attacks disguised as interview questions. He called out Jimmy's conduct in terms that were both professional and devastating, pointing out that the host had completely abandoned any pretense of journalistic integrity or basic human decency. Nathan explained to the now captivated audience that he had come on the show in good faith, expecting to have a conversation about his work and to connect with fans who might be interested in his projects. Instead, he had been subjected to what he characterized as a sustained personal attack from someone who seemed more interested in tearing him down than in conducting a meaningful interview. His words resonated with the audience, many of whom were nodding in agreement and clearly sympathetic to his position. The comedian then did something that Jimmy clearly hadn't expected. He turned directly to the camera and addressed the viewing audience, effectively bypassing Jimmy entirely. He spoke directly to the people watching at home, explaining what they had just witnessed, and making it clear that this was not normal behavior for a professional interview setting. It was a masterful move that completely undermined Jimmy's authority in his own studio and shifted the power dynamic entirely. Jimmy's reaction to being essentially ignored and bypassed in his own show was predictably explosive. He began shouting over Nathan, demanding that he sit down and continue the interview on Jimmy's terms. But Nathan was having none of it. He calmly gathered his things and made it clear that he would not be continuing with an interview that had devolved into personal attacks and professional misconduct. What happened next was the moment that would define this entire incident. Jimmy, realizing that he was losing control of the situation entirely and that Nathan was about to walk away looking like the clear winner in this confrontation, made a desperate play for power. He called for security, claiming that Nathan was being disruptive and needed to be removed from the studio. The audience gasped audibly at this development. Here was a host calling security on his own guest, not because the guest had done anything inappropriate or threatening, but simply because the guest had refused to continue being subjected to unprofessional treatment. It was an abuse of power, so blatant and obvious that even casual viewers would be able to see it for what it was. Nathan handled even this escalation with remarkable grace. As security approached, he made it clear that he was leaving voluntarily and that there was no need for any physical intervention. He used the moment to make one final statement about professional conduct and the responsibility that comes with having a platform like a late-night television show. His composure in the face of such treatment only made Jimmy's behavior look worse by comparison. The aftermath in the studio was telling. The audience was clearly unsettled by what they had witnessed, with many people talking among themselves and expressing their displeasure with how the situation had been handled. Some audience members were even leaving their seats, apparently not wanting to be associated with what had just transpired. Jimmy attempted to salvage the situation by making some jokes and trying to return to his normal hosting persona, but the damage was done. The audience was no longer with him. The energy in the room had completely shifted, and everyone present knew they had just witnessed something that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. As Nathan made his way off the stage and out of the studio, he maintained his dignity throughout. He didn't engage in shouting matches, didn't make threats or personal attacks, and didn't stoop to Jimmy's level despite being provoked repeatedly. His professional conduct throughout the entire ordeal stood in stark contrast to the host's behavior and made it clear to everyone watching who the real problem was in this situation. The incident concluded with Nathan's departure, but the impact of what had just happened was only beginning to be felt. The audience members who had witnessed this confrontation would soon be sharing their experiences online, and the footage of the interview would become some of the most talked about content in late-night television history. So there you have it, one of the most uncomfortable and revealing moments in recent television history. What started as a simple promotional interview became a masterclass in how power can corrupt and how some people in positions of authority will abuse that power when challenged. Make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that reveal the true character of people in the entertainment industry. And let me know in the comments, have you ever witnessed someone abuse their power like this in a professional setting?